Welcome back, you beautiful lot, to another episode of The Observing Eye. This week we are carrying on our season of Fire and Ice by exploring the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin was the guy that argued that consciousness is not a monologue but a conversation, that the self is not singular but multiple, and that we only become real through dialogue with others. Are you ready for that? I'm fucking not. Let's do it. You are not a finished sentence. You are not a closed book with a spine and a book cover and a definitive last page. You are a conversation that has no ending, a voice that keeps interrupting itself, a story that rewrites its own beginning every single morning you wake up and decide again who the hell you are going to be today. Mikhail Bakhtin knew this. Bakhtin, who spent years under house arrest in Soviet Russia, who was exiled, who watched his work get stolen and suppressed, and spent the last decade of his life in a nursing home dictating ideas to anyone who would listen. Bakhtin understood something so radical, so genuinely destabilizing, that the entire Western Academy has been trying to domesticate it ever since. He understood that the self is not a monologue. The self is a dialogue. And the moment you treat yourself as a finished, singular, coherent narrative, you have just committed a kind of spiritual violence against the most alive thing about you. We live in a culture that is obsessed with the finished self, the optimized self, the curated self, the self that has figured it out, that posts the proof, that performs completion like it's a product launch. LinkedIn is a graveyard of finished selves. Instagram is a museum of people who have already arrived. And every single one of those selves is a lie. Not because the people are dishonest, but because the self was never meant to be finished. To finish yourself is to stop listening. To stop listening is to die, just slowly, in a way that looks like success from the outside. Bakhtin called this monologic thinking, one voice, one authority, one final version of the truth. And he spent his entire intellectual life arguing against it. He wrote about polyphony. He wrote about the carnival. He wrote about how the greatest novels in human history are not books where one voice wins. They are books where voices collide, contradict, refuse to resolve. Dostoevsky didn't write characters who were wrong so that the narrator could correct them. He wrote characters who were each right, each broken, each incomplete, and he let them crash into each other like tectonic plates, and he didn't flinch in the process. This is the episode where we go there. This is where we take Bakhtin's most dangerous idea, the idea that you are not one person but many, that your identity is not a fortress but a threshold, and we hold it up to the light, and we turn it slowly, and we watch what it does to everything you thought you knew about yourself, about consciousness, about the way you talk to yourself when no one else is listening except the version of you that is still under construction. You are not finished. You were never finished. The question is whether you are brave enough to stay that way.
835 feet.
Think you know who you are. You have a name. You have a job title. You have a political position and a favorite band and a list of things you would never do. You have a story you tell at parties about the time you almost died, or the time you made a choice that changed everything, or the time you realized your parents were human beings and not monuments. You have curated this self the way an architect designs a building. Foundation, walls, windows, a door that only opens when you decide who gets to come in. But here is what Bakhtin saw when he looked at human consciousness. I'm probably pronouncing his name really wrong, so I apologize to anyone who speaks Russian better than I am, which is probably all of you. He realized that you did not build that self alone. You did not wake up one morning. You did not wake up one morning in a vacuum and invent your personality from scratch. Every single thing you think is yours, every opinion you hold, every value you defend, every fear that keeps you awake at night was given to you by someone else first. Your mother's voice, your teacher's expectation, your friend's judgment, the stranger who looked at you a certain way on the street when you were 17 and something inside you shifted forever. You are not a monologue. You are the echo chamber of 1,000 voices that spoke to you before you even knew you were listening. Bakhtin called this addressivity. Every utterance, every word, every thought you have is addressed to someone, even when you are alone. especially when you're alone. You're always speaking to an imagined listener, always performing for an invisible audience, and that audience isn't neutral. That audience shapes what you say before you say it. You censor yourself. You explain yourself. You defend yourself against accusations that have not even been made yet because somewhere deep in the architecture of your consciousness, there is a voice that is not yours, and you are terrified of what it might think. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetic license. This is how consciousness actually works. You do not have thoughts and then share them. You have thoughts in response to other thoughts that were never even yours to begin with. Your internal monologue is not a monologue at all. It is a dialogue where you play both parts and pretend you're in control. You are the ventriloquist and the dummy, and you've been doing this so long you forgot there was a difference. Bakhtin spent years studying Dostoevsky because Dostoevsky understood this better than almost anyone who has ever written fiction. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov does not have a singular coherent self. He has voices, competing voices, voices that argue with each other, contradict each other, refuse to resolve into one clean answer. He talks to himself the way you talk to yourself. One voice says you are special, you're different, the rules don't apply to you. Another voice says you're a coward, you're ordinary, you're nothing. And neither voice is lying, both voices are true, and the novel does not tell you which one wins because that is not how life works. You walk around pretending you are one person, but you are not. You are at least three people at any given moment. There is the person you think you are, the person you want to be, and the person other people think you are when you are not in the room. And none of these people fully overlap. They exist in tension, in conflict, in a kind of unresolved harmony that only holds together because you refuse to examine it too closely. You are Raskolnikov. You contain multitudes. And the moment you pretend otherwise, the moment you flatten yourself into a brand or a biography or a bullet-pointed list of achievements, you have just murdered the most interesting thing about you. Now here's the uncomfortable part. You need other people to be yourself. Not in the soft, inspirational poster way, live, love, fucking laugh. Not in the way that makes you feel warm and connected. You need other people because without them you do not exist. Bakhtin wrote that the self is not given but created through dialogue. You do not come into the world with a self already installed like factory settings. You build a self in response to the voices around you. Your mother tells you to be careful and you become cautious. Your father tells you to be strong and you become silent. Your lover tells you that you are too much and you spend the next 10 years becoming less. You are not the author of your own story. You are the co-author. And the other authors do not always ask for permission before they start writing. This is why isolation destroys people. Not because humans are social animals who need companionship for survival. That is true, but it is not the point. Isolation destroys people because the self only exists in relation. Put someone in solitary confinement and watch what happens. The voices do not stop. They multiply. They become louder, stranger, more hostile. The prisoner starts arguing with the people who are not there, starts hearing accusations that no one is making. The self, deprived of real dialogue, starts creating imaginary dialogue just to keep existing, because a self without another is not a self at all. It is a ghost haunting an empty room. You don't want to believe this. You want to believe you're autonomous, self-made, independently real. You want to believe that if everyone disappeared tomorrow, you would still be you. But Bakhtin is telling you that this is a fantasy, a comforting lie. The you that you think is yours was built in conversation with a world that never stops talking. Your thoughts are not original, they are responses. Your identity is not fixed, it is negotiated. And every single person you have ever loved or hated or ignored has left a fingerprint on the thing you call your soul. So what does that mean? What do you do with the knowledge that you are not one but many? That your consciousness is not a kingdom but a parliament? That every time you open your mouth or close your eyes or make a decision, you are channeling voices that were never even yours to begin with? You could panic. You could spiral. You could decide that if the self is not real, then nothing is real and you might as well surrender to the algorithm and let the feed decide who you are today. Or you could do what Bakhtin did. You could stop trying to finish yourself. You could stop performing coherence. You could let the voices speak. All of them. Even the ones that contradict. Even the ones that make you uncomfortable. Because the unfinished self is not a failure. The unfinished self is the only self that is still alive. There is a moment in every carnival when the rules collapse. When the king becomes the fool and the fool becomes the king and nobody knows who they are anymore because the masks have stopped being costumes and started being confessions. Bakhtin loved the carnival, not because it was fun, not because it was colourful or chaotic or a nice break from the seriousness of Soviet life. He loved the carnival because it was the one place where people stopped pretending they were singular, coherent, finished selves and just let the multiplicity spill out into the street. The medieval carnival was not entertainment. It was ritual. It was the one time of year when the social order inverted, when priests got drunk and peasants wore crowns and everyone said the things they were not allowed to say the other 364 days. It was not escapism, it was exposure. The carnival did not let you escape yourself. It forced you to confront all the selves you've been suppressing just to get through the day without screaming. Bakhtin called this carnivalization, and he didn't mean it as a metaphor for fun. He meant it as a structure of consciousness. The carnival is what happens when you stop enforcing the hierarchy inside your own head. When you stop letting one voice dominate. When you let the beggar and the bishop and the madman all have equal time at the microphone and you don't flinch when they start screaming over each other. You do not live in a carnival. You live in a monologue. Your life is organized around a single authoritative voice that tells you who you are and what you should want and how you should feel about it. That voice might be your parents. It might be your boss. It might be the algorithm that decides what you see when you open your phone because you cannot sleep and you need something, anything, to tell you that you still exist. But whoever that voice belongs to, it is not the only voice. It is just the loudest. And every day you spend reinforcing that voice, every time you scroll past the discomfort or ignore the contradiction, or tell yourself that you have it figured out, you are committing a small act of violence against every other version of yourself that is trying to speak. Here is what the carnival teaches you. There is no such thing as a pure, untouchable official self. There is only the self you perform in public, and the self you hide in private, and the self that emerges when the performance breaks down. And all three of those selves are real. All three of those selves are you. The carnival doesn't ask you to choose. It says wear all the masks at once and see what happens when they start fighting. Now you might be terrified of this. You spent your entire life building walls between yourselves. There's the you at work who's professional and competent and never admits when you're lost. There's the you at home who's tired and mean and can't stop refreshing the same 3 websites even though you know it's making you worse. There's the you in bed at night who whispers confessions to the ceiling that you would never say out loud, because if anyone heard them, you'd have to leave the country and start over. You keep these selves separate because you believe that integration is the goal. You believe that maturity means becoming one person, one coherent narrative, one voice that speaks for all the others. But Bakhtin is telling you that this is a trap, that the monologic self is not maturity, it is repression. It is the voice of authority telling you that contradiction is weakness, that ambiguity is failure, that if you cannot explain yourself in a clean, linear story, then you've not done the work. But the carnival says otherwise. The carnival says the work is not integration. The work is letting the voices speak without demanding that they agree. It's holding the tension without resolving it into something safe. This is why Dostoevsky is so important in this. It's why Bakhtin spent years analyzing the Brothers Karamazov like it was some kind of sacred text. Dostoevsky didn't write novels where one character was right. He wrote novels where every character had a piece of the truth, and every piece contradicted every other piece, and he didn't apologize for it. Ivan was right, Alyosha is right, Dmitri is right, and they're all right and they're all wrong, and the novel doesn't choose. The novel holds the space for all of them to exist at once. It carnivalizes consciousness. It lets the voices scream. And just a little bit of self-promotion. If you like Dostoevsky, there's an episode about 3 episodes back where we dive into Dostoevsky and all of his ideas. So go give that a listen if you're enjoying the season of Fire and Ice. Okay, short advert over. Just an advert for me, don't panic. Right, carry on. Carry on, David. You don't let the voices scream. You have a hierarchy. You've decided, well, let mine scream. You've decided, I scream into the pillow all the time. You've decided what thoughts are acceptable and what thoughts need to be shoved into the basement and locked behind a door that you pretend doesn't exist. You have a public shelf. I have a public shelf. Here are my wares. You have a public self and a shadow self. And you've spent so much energy keeping them apart that you've convinced yourself the shadow self isn't real. that it's just intrusive thoughts, just a bad day, just a part of you that doesn't count. But it fucking counts. It all counts. The part of you that wants to quit your job and disappear into the woods counts. The part of you that's cruel when you're tired counts. The part of you that envies your friends and hates your body and fantasizes about violence or escape or a version of yourself that doesn't have to smile through one more fucking meeting counts. These are not glitches. These are voices. And the more you silence them, the louder they get. The more you exile them down into that basement, the more they start running the house from down below. The carnival is not about letting chaos win. It's about acknowledging that chaos is already here, that you are already multiple, that the clean, branded, linked-in version of yourself is not the truth. It's just the mask you wear in public because you're terrified of what would happen if you took it off. But here's the secret. What Bakhtin understood and what Dostoevsky documented and what you've been avoiding since the moment you learned to perform coherence was this. The mask is not protecting you. The mask is suffocating you. And the longer you wear it, the harder it becomes to remember what your actual face looks like underneath. So what would happen if you stopped? What would happen if you let the voices argue? If you acknowledge that you are both the person who wants to be good and the person who's tired of being good? That you are both the person who loves your life and the person who wants to burn it down and start over? What would happen if you stopped trying to resolve the contradiction and just lived inside it for a while? You'd become carnivalized. You'd become unfinished. You would become, for the first time in a long time I imagine, something that resembles the truth. Now it's not a comfortable truth. It's not a truth that you can fit on a business card, but it is a truth that breathes, that moves, that's still under construction, and always will be. There are two kinds of voices that live inside you. Bakhtin called them the authoritative word and the internally persuasive word. And the difference between them is the difference between a prison and a conversation, between a command and a question, between the life you were told to live and the life that might actually be yours if you ever stop listening long enough to hear it. The authoritative word comes from the outside. It arrives with weight, with credentials, the full force of institutional backing and cultural expectation, and the collected wisdom of everyone who came before you and decided how things should be. Your parents spoke the authoritative word when they told you what success looks like. Your teachers spoke it when they explained what intelligence means. Your religion spoke it when it handed you a map of morality with all the borders already drawn. The authoritative word does not ask for your opinion. It doesn't negotiate. It announces itself and waits for you to comply. And you comply. Of course you comply. You were 3 years old when the authoritative word started speaking, and you did not know you were allowed to argue. You absorbed it like radiation. You internalized it so completely that by the time you were old enough to question it, you couldn't tell where the voice ended and you began. The authoritative word became your superego, your inner critic, the judge that sits in your head and delivers verdicts about every choice you make and every thought you have and every version of yourself that doesn't match the template you were given. But what the authoritative word can't do is adapt. It can't grow. It can't respond to new information or change circumstances or the reality that you are not the same person you were when you first heard it. The authoritative word is fixed, rigid, finished. It speaks from a position of absolute certainty and it demands that you shape yourself to fit its requirements. And if you can't fit, if some part of you refuses to be carved down to size, then the authoritative word tells you that the problem is you, that you are broken, that you need to try harder, that you are failing at the most basic task of being human, which is apparently to become exactly what someone else decided you should be before you were even born. You know this voice. You hear it every time you measure yourself against an invisible standard and come up short. Every time you think about changing careers but stop yourself because what would people think? Every time you edit your sentences and your clothes and your laugh because some part of you believes that the real you is not acceptable. The authoritative word isn't always wrong. That's what makes it so dangerous. Sometimes it's right. Sometimes the wisdom of generations actually is wisdom. But the authoritative word does not care whether it is right. It only cares that you obey. The internally persuasive word is different. The internally persuasive word doesn't arrive with credentials. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. and institutional backing. It emerges from dialogue, from conversation, from the messy, uncertain process of testing ideas against experience and seeing what survives. The internally persuasive word is a thought that keeps coming back when you try to ignore it. It's the question that won't let you sleep. The feeling that something is wrong even though you can't articulate what or why. The internally persuasive word is not finished. It's still figuring itself out, and it needs you to help. Bakhtin said that the internally persuasive word is half yours and half someone else's. It comes from outside, from books you've read or conversations you've had or moments when someone said something that cracked open a door you didn't know existed. But it doesn't arrive demanding obedience. It arrives as possibility, as invitation. You take it in and you turn it over and you test it against your life, and slowly, quietly, it becomes part of how you think. Not because someone told you it should, but because it earned its place through persuasion, through relevance, through the simple fact that it helped you make sense of something that was not making sense before. This is how you actually change, not by following orders, not by submission to authority. You change by engaging with ideas that are still alive, still open to revision. You change through dialogue, through the kind of conversation where neither person walks away the same, where the words move between you and transform in transit and come back different than they left. The internally persuasive word does not give you answers. It gives you better questions. Welcome to fucking philosophy. And better questions are the only thing that can compete with the authoritative answers you've been carrying around like stones in your pockets. But here's the problem. This is why most people never make it past the authoritative word. The internally persuasive word is uncomfortable. It's uncertain. It doesn't have guarantees or 5-star reviews or the approval of everyone you ever wanted to impress. The internally persuasive word says maybe everything you were told was wrong. Maybe the life you built isn't the life you want. Maybe the person you've been performing isn't the person you are. And if you let that word in, if you let it become persuasive, you cannot unsee it. You can't go back to the comfort of certainty. You can't pretend anymore. So you resist it. You dismiss it. You tell yourself it's just a phase or a moment of weakness or the kind of thought that serious people do not entertain. You reach for the authoritative word like a security blanket. You remind yourself of what you are supposed to want, supposed to be, supposed to feel. You perform the monologue. You reinforce the walls. You silence the dialogue before it gets too loud. And meanwhile, the internally persuasive word keeps whispering, keeps showing you glimpses of a self that doesn't fit the script. And you can spend your whole life trying not to hear it. You can build a career around not hearing it. You can build a marriage and a family and a retirement plan around not hearing it. But it doesn't go away. It just gets quieter. And the quieter it gets, the more you start to feel like you're living someone else's life in your own body. Bakhtin understood that consciousness is a battlefield between these two kinds of words, between the voices that demand obedience and the voices that invite transformation, between the finished self that culture handed you and the unfinished self that keeps you trying to emerge. And the real tragedy is not that most people choose the authoritative word. The tragedy is that most people don't realize they have a choice. They think the authoritative word is the only word. They think the voice in their head that sounds like judgment and expectation and inherited wisdom is their own voice. They have confused ventriloquism with authenticity. You're probably doing this right now. Some part of you is reading these words and another part of you is already preparing the rebuttal, already reaching for the authoritative word to protect you from the internally persuasive one. You're already deciding that this is interesting, but it's not applicable to me. Provocative, but not true. The kind of thing you think about for a moment and then dismiss because you have a mortgage and responsibilities and a reputation to maintain. And that voice isn't wrong. That voice is trying to keep you safe. But safety isn't the same thing as truth. And at some point, you have to decide which one matters more. Bakhtin had a word for the place where you actually exist. Not the place where you think you exist, not the self you perform or the identity you curate or the story you tell at dinner parties. The place where you are actually alive. He called it the threshold. And the threshold is not a comfortable place. It's not a destination. It's the space between, that liminal space, the border, the edge of one thing becoming another. The moment before the decision, the second after the mask cracks. The threshold is where you stand when you don't know who you are anymore and you've not figured out who you're going to become. You spend your entire life trying to avoid the threshold. You build routines and identities and carefully constructed narratives specifically so you never have to stand there, exposed, uncertain, and unfinished. You want solid ground. You want answers. You want to be the kind of person who's figured it out. But Bakhtin is telling you that the threshold is the only place where anything real happens. Everything else is just repetition, just performance, just a monologue you've memorized so well you don't even hear yourself saying it anymore. Let's come back to Dostoevsky. His characters didn't sit in living rooms having civilized conversations about their feelings. They stand in doorways, in stairwells, in prison cells, in gambling halls and streets at midnight. They exist in threshold spaces where the normal rules of social performance collapse and something raw breaks through. Raskolnikov doesn't confess in church. He confesses in the middle of a crowded square because the threshold is not a private space. The threshold is where your internal dialogue becomes external, where the voices you've been suppressing suddenly have witnesses, where you cannot pretend anymore because someone is watching and they can see exactly what you've been hiding. Now you think that the self is something you construct in private and then present to the world when it's ready. You think identity is something you work on in isolation, like a sculpture you're carving in a closed studio. And one day you're going to open those doors and reveal the finished product and everyone's going to applaud. But Bakhtin says that this is backwards. The self is not made in isolation. The self is made on the threshold, in the encounter, in the moment when another person looks at you and sees something you did not know was visible. You can't see your own face. You can't know your own expression. You walk through the world blind to the thing that everyone else sees first. You need mirrors. You need other people to reflect you back to yourself, but not in the way you think, not the polite reflections, not the version of yourself that your friends confirm and your family recognizes. You need the uncomfortable reflections, the ones that show you the parts you've been hiding, the moments when someone reacts to you in a way that doesn't match your self-image and you feel that spike of panic because they're seeing something real and you're not in control of what that means. Bakhtin called this outsideness. The other person has access to parts of you that you will never see. They see your face from the outside. They hear your voice the way it actually sounds. They watch your body language and your micro-expressions and all the unconscious signals you broadcast without knowing. And because they're outside you, they complete you. Not in the romantic sense, of course, not in the way that makes you feel whole and validated. They complete you by showing you the parts of yourself that only exist in relation. The parts that only emerge when you are being witnessed. This is why isolation is not just lonely. Isolation is existentially incomplete. Put yourself in the room alone for long enough and you start to lose definition. You get fuzzy around the edges. The boundaries of the self start to blur. You need the other. You need the other because the self only exists in dialogue. The threshold only exists when there is someone on the other side. And without that threshold, without that encounter, you are just a voice talking to itself in an empty room and slowly forgetting what it sounds like. But here's the terror. Here's why you avoid the threshold even though it's the only place you're real. The other person might not reflect back the self you want them to see. They might see your cruelty, your pettiness, your need, your fear. They might see the version of you that you've spent years trying to kill off, and by seeing it, they make it real again. They make it undeniable. You can lie to yourself in private. You can tell yourself you're kind when you're actually just conflict averse. You can tell yourself that you're independent when you're actually just afraid of intimacy. But you cannot lie when someone is looking at you and their eyes say they see something else. This is what happens in Dostoevsky's novels. Characters see each other too clearly. Raskolnikov looks at Sonia and sees someone who knows exactly what he's done, even though he's not said it out loud. Dmitri looks at his father and sees his own violence reflected back at him. Ivan looks at Smerdyakov and realizes that his philosophy has consequences, that his ideas do not stay abstract when someone else starts taking them seriously. The threshold is where you discover that you are not alone in your own head, that other people are not just mirrors, they are voices, and those voices are shaping you whether you want them to or not. You feel this every time you're about to be honest with someone and you stop yourself. Every time you're about to say the thing you actually think and then you edit it, soften it, make it acceptable. You're standing on the threshold and you're choosing to step back. You're choosing the monologue over the dialogue because the dialogue is dangerous. The dialogue means you might have to change. The dialogue means you might discover that the person you think you are is not the person you actually are. And that discovery is not enlightenment. That discovery is death. The death of the old self, the finished self, the self you spent so much time building. But Bakhtin is saying that this death is not the end. This death is the only thing that keeps you alive. The unfinished self is the self that can still grow, the self that can still respond, that's still in dialogue with the world instead of locked in a monologue with itself. You stand on the threshold and you let someone see you, and in that seeing, you become something you were not before. Not because they changed you, because the encounter revealed something that was always there but had no witness. This is why love is so terrifying. Not because you might get hurt, but because love forces you onto the threshold. Love means someone is looking at you closely enough to see the things you hide, and you can either retreat, close the door, go back to the safety of your performed self, or you can stay there, exposed, unfinished, letting the dialogue happen even though you do not know where it leads. Letting yourself be completed by someone whose version of you doesn't match your own. And that might be the bravest thing a person can do. Not to finish yourself, but to let yourself be seen before you're ready. Bakhtin had a phrase for the kind of ideas that refuse to die. He called it the great time. Not your time, not the time of trending topics and viral moments and cultural obsessions that burn bright for 6 weeks and then vanish like they never existed. The great time is the time of ideas that outlive their authors. Ideas that get buried and forgotten and declared irrelevant and then, decades or centuries later, come roaring back because someone finally understands what they were trying to say. Bakhtin wrote his most important work in the 1920s and 30s, under Stalin, under a regime that demanded singular truth, official narratives, one voice speaking for the entire nation. And Bakhtin, this man with no political power and every reason to shut up and survive, wrote about polyphony, about dialogue, about the fundamental impossibility of a single authoritative voice ever capturing the full truth of human consciousness. He wrote these ideas and then watched them get suppressed, watched his books get pulped, watched his name disappear from the academic record like he never existed. But the ideas did not die. They went underground. They circulated in samizdat, those self-published manuscripts that dissidents passed hand to hand under the table because official channels were closed. They survived in fragments, in student notes, in conversations that people had in private where the walls might be listening but the ideas were too important to kill with silence. And then, decades later, after Bakhtin was already exiled, already forgotten, someone rediscovered his work. Someone recognized that these ideas were not historical curiosities. They were answers to questions the culture was finally ready to ask. This is the great time. This is what happens when an idea is so true, so fundamentally aligned with how consciousness actually works, that it cannot be killed. You can ban it, you can ignore it, you can declare it irrelevant or dangerous or outdated. But if the idea is touching something real, something structural about what it means to be human, it will come back. Not because of marketing, not because someone decided it should trend. It will come back because people keep encountering the same problems and they keep needing the same answers. And eventually, someone remembers that somebody already said this, they've already mapped this territory, left a trail through the wilderness. We live in a culture that has no concept of the great time. We live in the time of the algorithm, the time of the news cycle, of planned obsolescence where ideas are designed to expire as soon as the next quarter starts. You consume content that was made to be forgotten. You participate in conversations that are designed to dissolve the moment the engagement metrics drop. You build your identity around references that will be incomprehensible in 5 years. I fucking hope everyone forgets 6-7. And you do this because you have been taught that relevance is the highest value. That if something is not trending, it does not matter. That the past is dead, and the future is unknowable, and all that exists is this present moment and whatever the feed decides to show you right now. But the great time does not care about relevance. The great time operates on a different scale. Bakhtin wrote about Dostoevsky and Rabelais not because they were trending. He wrote about them because they understood something about consciousness that their contemporaries missed, something that took a century to recognize. And it's still being discovered by people who stumble across their work and feel that shock of recognition, that feeling of, oh, this person saw it too. This person knew what I'm only now beginning to understand. This is what it means to think in the great time, to write for an audience that does not exist yet, to trust that if you are touching something real, something true about the structure of human experience, then someone, someday, will need what you are saying. Even if that someone is born 50 years after you die, even if the culture you are writing in is actively hostile to what you're trying to say, you write it anyway, you preserve it anyway, you trust the great time. You're not doing this. You are writing for the algorithm. You are performing for the metrics. You are shaping your thoughts to fit the platform's requirements because you have been taught that if nobody sees it, it doesn't count. You edit yourself before you speak. You preemptively censor the parts that might not land. You chase virality instead of truth because virality is measurable and truth is not. And you've been trained to value only what could be quantified. But what the great time teaches you is that things that matter do not always matter immediately. The ideas that last are not always the ideas that trend. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is say something true and just let it sit there, unacknowledged, unvalidated, waiting for the moment when the culture finally catches up. Sometimes the great time demands patience, demands faith, demands that you plant seeds you will never see bloom because the harvest happens after you are gone. Bakhtin died in 1975. He spent the last years of his life in a nursing home, largely forgotten, his work still suppressed, his name still absent from the official academic narrative. He did not live to see the explosion of interest in his ideas. He did not live to see his concepts become foundational to literary theory, to cultural studies, to the way we understand narrative and consciousness and the structure of the self. He wrote into the void, and the void wrote back, but he was already dead by the time the reply arrived. This could be depressing. This could be a story about futility, about a man who did the work and never got the recognition. But that's not what the great time means. The great time means Bakhtin won, not in his lifetime and not in a way that he could measure, but his ideas are still here, still alive, and still shaping how people think about consciousness and dialogue and the unfinished self. Stalin is dead. The Soviet Union is dead. The regime that tried to silence Bakhtin is a historical footnote, but the ideas survived. The ideas are in the great time now, and that means they are beyond the reach of any authority that tries to kill them. You want immediate validation. You want to know that what you are doing matters right now. You want the likes and the shares and the comments that prove someone is listening. But the great time does not work that way. The great time asks whether what you are saying is true enough, deep enough, and real enough to outlive the moment. Whether it touches something structural. Whether it will still make sense when the platform is gone and the trend is over and the only thing left is the idea itself, naked and unadorned, waiting for someone who needs it. Bakhtin believed in the great time because he had no choice. He couldn't win in his own time, but he wrote anyway. He trusted that the dialogue was not over, that the unfinished conversation would continue even after he was gone. And he was right. The conversation is still happening. You are a part of it. Right now, listening to a man who's been dead for 50 years explain something about your own consciousness that you did not have words for until this moment. This is the great time. This is what it means to refuse to be buried. So here is what you do with this. Here's what you take from Bakhtin and Dostoevsky and the unfinished self and the threshold and the great time, and you carry back into your actual life where the rent is due and there's dishes that need washing and children screaming. Nobody gives a fuck about polyphony or carnivalization or the authoritative word versus the internally persuasive word. You stop trying to finish yourself. You stop treating your identity like a project with a deadline. You stop performing coherence for an audience that isn't even watching. You acknowledge that you are multiple, that you contain voices, that some of those voices contradict each other, and that is not a bug. This is not something to fix. This is the structure of consciousness. This is what it means to be alive. You start listening to the internally persuasive word. Not the voice that arrives with authority and demands obedience. The voice that arrives as a question, as a possibility, as something that keeps coming back even when you try to ignore it. You let that voice speak. You let it argue with the other voices. You let the dialogue happen inside you instead of pretending there is only one true self that needs to win. This is not fucking Highlander. There can be more than one. You stand on the threshold. You let people see you before you're ready. You stop editing yourself into acceptability and you risk the encounter. The real encounter. Where someone might see something you didn't want them to see and you don't immediately retreat back into performance. You stay there, exposed, unfinished. You let the other person complete you in ways you cannot complete yourself. And you think in the great time. You stop measuring your worth by what trends today. You stop shaping your thoughts to fit the algorithm. You trust that if you are saying something true, something real, something that touches the actual structure of human experience, then it will find the people who need it. Maybe not today, maybe not in your lifetime, but the great time is patient. The great time does not forget. Bakhtin spent years writing ideas that his government tried to bury. And now you know his name. Now his ideas are shaping how you think about yourself. That isn't luck. That is an accident. That is what happens when you refuse to be monologic. When you refuse to let authority have the last word. When you trust the dialogue enough to keep it going even when nobody is listening. You are not finished. You were never supposed to be finished. The question is whether you are brave enough to live like it. To stop performing completion. To let the voices argue. To stand on the threshold and let yourself be seen. To plant seeds in the great time and trust that someone, someday, will need what you are trying to say. You are unfinished. That is not a failure. That is the only proof that you are still alive. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for joining me today. If Bakhtin's unfinished self feels more threatening than comforting, then that should tell you something. If the idea that you are not one coherent person, but a collection of voices, makes you want to stop this podcast and return to the safety of your performed identity, then good. That resistance is your monologue trying to protect itself from the dialogue that might actually set you free. If you want to keep standing on the threshold with me, you can find the show in all the usual digital feeding troughs. We're on TikTok, Instagram and X with the handle @TheObservingEye, and we're on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye as well. And then there's Substack, which is the actual home base of The Observing Eye, at theobservingeye.com. Go there if you want the full transcripts, some deeper explorations, and the stuff that doesn't fit in the podcast because it requires you to sit with it, to think about it, to let the internally persuasive word argue with the authoritative word until something real emerges. Completely ad-free, of course, because advertisements are just the authoritative word teaching you to consume your way to completion. If something in this episode is making the voices in your head argue louder than usual, don't silence them. Join the conversation. Drop a comment, send a message, fire an email into the void at david@theobservingeye.com. I am on the other end, unfinished and waiting to hear which version of yourself decided to reach out. And if you want to support the show, don't just passively consume it. Share it. Hand it to someone whose curated, branded Instagram perfect self is suffocating under the weight of coherence. Give it to the person who thinks they've got it figured out. Or that someone who needs to remember they're a dialogue and not a monologue. Thank you for listening. In a world demanding you become one singular, marketable, finished product, your refusal to complete yourself is a testament to your authenticity. I appreciate you holding that space here. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.